Guys, wanted to do a quick video on Lamont Peterson. I'm not going to do a full post-fight video on his matchup with David Avanesyan for two reasons. Number one, at the time of recording, it's Monday night, I'm late to the party. And number two, if I'm honest, I did watch the fight, but I can't say I've sat down and scored it and watched it properly. What I will say is, I've never been sold on David Avanesyan. You know, I never thought that he was some sort of star welterweight or anything like that. But I thought Lamont Peterson looked good in the fight. Lamont Peterson traditionally has been a 140-pound fighter, stepped up to 147 pounds to fight for the WBA regular title in this matchup. And I thought on the whole he looked pretty good. Lamont Peterson has always been a fighter I've had a respect for. And to be honest, if you actually look at his resume, he's got some very, very decent form. He seems to be a guy who tends to lose at a very, very elite level of the sport. I mean, if you look at the losses, he was stopped by Matisse, he lost to Tim Bradley, he lost in a very, very, very controversial fight to Danny Garcia. But at the same time, you know, there's some bits and pieces of, you know, real form on his resume. In a controversial fight, as you guys know, he beat Amir Khan. In another controversial fight, he beat Felix Diaz, obviously beat Avanesyan last night, and there's some other names on the resume as well. He beat Peterson and, you know, one or two other fighters who you guys will be familiar with. So, you know, I give Lamont Peterson some credit. I'm not 100% sure that he really is cut out for the welterweight division. For me, he's a guy who may be more effective at 140 pounds. But given the way he's positioned in the sport, I can understand why he's fighting at 147 pounds. Lamont Peterson is a guy who's a big name, and he's perhaps in big name fights. But at the same time, he's probably always the B-side in those big name fights. So unlike Adrian Broner, where he could maybe go down to 140 and get a succession of big name opponents on his terms, I kind of feel with Lamont Peterson, because he's going to be the B-side when it comes to the real big matchups, he's better off at 147, as there's a wider array of top-class names who he can get entertaining fights with. For me, Peterson looked good last night, and the reasons he looked good were the reasons that I like Lamont Peterson. In the first two rounds, Peterson comes out, he's on the back foot, he's showing excellent movement, he's calm, he's composed, he's keeping the distance, and he's working the jab. And he's really showing that the guy actually is a relatively slick boxer from distance when he wants to be. You know, a lot of us UK fans, our abiding memory of Lamont Peterson is him attacking Amir Khan, it's him grinding down at Amir Khan, it's him being the pressure fighter, it's him being the closer, it's him trying to sit on Amir Khan's chest and sort of grapple with him and wrestle with him and break him down inside the pocket. And it's kind of easy to forget that Lamont Peterson is actually a fairly skilled, slick operator boxing at a long distance. If you need any more proof of that, look at the trouble he gave Danny Garcia in their matchup. But yeah, in the early rounds of this fight, Lamont Peterson, for me, is controlling the rounds at distance. And when he does that, when he's moving around the ring, he looks very calm and very composed. Peterson then comes into range and, you know, likes really to fight inside the pocket. He's a guy who is comfortable on the outside, but for me is really at his most happiest when he's having a fight in a phone booth. So he comes in and he's educated on the inside. You know, he's not mad, he's not wild. You couldn't necessarily say he's a brawler. You know, a lot of times when you think of guys who like to put on the pressure, you think of guys like, I don't know, Marcus Maidana, you think of guys like Sean Porter. Lamont Peterson is a guy who, you know, brings that heat to the equation, but he's very composed. You know, you see him calculating the angles on the inside, you see him working the body nicely, you see him placing his punches well. And I think that's what I kind of like about Lamont Peterson. There are weaknesses to Peterson's game. I guess most notably, he's not a dynamite puncher. He's probably not the biggest guy in the world. He seems to go through spells where he maybe doesn't fight for 3 minutes of every round. And because of that, you know, and let's face it, he's now 33, fighting in a division that isn't his natural division. Because of that, he's probably not going to go down as the top guy at welterweight anytime soon. But nevertheless, there's big fights out there for Lamont Peterson. So, you know, I was having a think before making this video, and there's three names that for me really stand out that, you know, I actually give Lamont Peterson reasonable chances of success in all three of the fights. And for my money, they'd actually be very, very entertaining matchups. The first is the Amir Khan rematch. Khan needs a big fight. He's coming off a big, big loss against Canelo Alvarez. UK fans are maybe slightly giving Khan a bit more stick than usual because of the perception that he ducked Kell Brook, rightly or wrongly. This is a very sellable fight from Khan's perspective because obviously it was a rematch. The first fight was very entertaining. The first fight was very controversial. And I personally would view it as a 50-50 matchup. Khan maybe has a speed advantage. Khan is maybe the slightly bigger guy. But Lamont Peterson's style and the way he can bring the heat and the pressure was the kryptonite to Amir Khan first time round. So it's certainly a rematch I'd like to see. From Lamont Peterson's perspective, it's a winnable fight against a huge name and a chance to get a big payday. From Amir Khan's perspective, Lamont Peterson now has that WBA regular title. Is this Amir Khan's chance to say that he's a world champion again? Furthermore, from Amir Khan's perspective, how many fights is he going to be able to take that are classed as big, exciting fights where the guy punches, isn't a big puncher? I mean, Khan's biggest problem, as we know, is his chin. And Lamont Peterson, good fighter, not a massive power puncher. So, for me, that's a fight that actually does make quite a lot of sense and a fight that wouldn't surprise me. Adrian Broner versus Lamont Peterson. I appreciate those guys are friends in some sort of fashion, but that's also a very, very interesting fight. And let's face it, they fought on the same night last night. Perhaps there was some idea that they could have a fight in future. Also factoring that they're both 140 guys now fighting at 147. Perhaps they're more fairly matched in terms of size, and neither of them would be perceived to have a substantial size disadvantage as they would against some of the top names. Really, really interesting what that fight potentially could, how that fight could pan out. I guess there's the perception, rightly or wrongly, that Adrian Broner is the classier operator with the higher upside. But if you look at the success that Adrian Granados had last night against Adrian Broner, I actually think Lamont Peterson could well upset the apple cart and beat Adrian Broner. Because, funnily enough, I think Peterson would fight in a very similar way as Granados, but with slightly more education and slightly more class. Peterson, I think, could move around the ring and use distance just as well as Granados did in the early rounds of the fight with Broner. And I think Peterson may be stronger than Broner when it comes to, having a bit of a grapple and fighting inside the pocket. So those are certainly big fights. And I believe now that he's the WBA regular champion, he will be mandated to fight the WBA super champion, who will be the winner between Danny Garcia and Keith Thurman. Now, either of those fights is a good fight. Let's face it, the first fight with Danny Garcia was a highly, highly, highly controversial matchup that really could have gone either way. A fight with Keith Thurman would also interest me. Keith Thurman, I think, would have some advantages over Lamont Peterson. There'd be a substantial size advantage, there'd be a substantial power advantage. And I think Keith Thurman may have more success taking some of the length away from Lamont Peterson. But nevertheless, the way to beat Keith Thurman for me probably is to bring the pressure on him, to hit him to the body, to take away his distance. I actually thought Sean Porter would have more success doing that than he did, and Keith Thurman really impressed me that night. But what I would say is a guy like Lamont Peterson, with the heat that he could bring, would once again be a good test for Keith Thurman. There's some big fights out there, and I think some of these fights are going to have to be made in the 147-pound division, because there's a lot of guys at present, guys like Lamont Peterson, guys like Amir Khan, guys like Adrian Broner, who are good fighters. They're in the mix, they're on people's lips, but they're not really on the top tier right now. These are kind of guys who are, a bit below, like the Kell Brooks and Errol Spences and Garcias and Thurmans and Pacquiao's of the world. But there's this very, very good second tier, if you like, of fighters active at 147. And I think there could be some real good fights to get made. I mean, Khan Broner is another one that, for me, on paper, makes sense. Broner would fancy his chances of knocking out Khan. Khan would fancy his chances of outmanoeuvring and boxing Broner along. So I think Lamont Peterson is a key man to look at, because I suspect he will be in a big fight, and I suspect we'll see him in a fight in 2017. And do you know what? With some of those options available to him, Lamont Peterson versus Amir Khan, Lamont Peterson versus Adrian Broner, even Peterson versus a Garcia Thurman winner, I wouldn't rule him out. And you know, stylistically, the way he can mix it up from outside and then bringing the heat into the pocket means he's a tough test for all out there. So Lamont Peterson's a guy I'm keeping one eye on, and I suspect we'll see him in a notable fight. Let me know your thoughts. How did you think he performed against Avanesyan? Do you think he's going to be better at 147 pounds? Who would you like to see him fight next? Many thanks indeed for your time watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please take the time to hit the thumbs up button. That helps gain viewers and add some visibility to the show on YouTube. Also take the time to hit subscribe. I'm trying to keep my channel moving and gain some momentum in terms of growing it out. So if you take the time to hit subscribe, you can check out all my other stuff, and I'd massively appreciate that. Thanks very much for tuning in, guys.